There are quite a lot of different ways to draw hair, and especially when it's stylized, the possibilities seem to be endless. Social media is flooded with tutorials, let's be real, but the question for another one is always there, so today we're gonna look at some styles and techniques that I like to use. I'm someone who gets bored really easily if I always draw the same things, so I like to bring in some variety every now and then. I also have very different ways to go about this depending on what I'm using the art for. For example, if I'm drawing for my webcomic, then it's near impossible for me to fully render every single panel of the story, so I will draw the hair of my characters a lot different in that case. That's why I won't just show you one way to do it, but I will give you some inspiration for multiple styles. First, I'm gonna start with my fully rendered style because that's probably what most people are interested in. In contrast to my other styles, this one is way more detailed but also pretty fun to draw when I'm working on complete illustrations. I usually, but not always, start with a sketch. How detailed or simple the sketch itself will be is usually something I decide in the moment, something just based on my patience, honestly. Sometimes I feel like not having a sketch leaves more room for spontaneous ideas, especially if you're not really sure what you actually want to draw that day. Generally what I go for is a spiky look, lots of layers depending on the hairstyle of course, and if possible I like to make it fluffy with lots of volume. These steps are obviously nothing you have to do, it's just what's most fun for me, and you can very well also just use some of these steps that you like and leave out the others. I'm gonna start by showing you how this works with single strands of hair and then show you what the complete thing looks like. This is how you start normally. You start out with bigger strands of hair and then work your way through by adding smaller strands everywhere you feel like it would look good. This can also help making the whole thing seem more 3D by playing around with the perspective of the single strands of hair and later in the process the shading. The next thing I like to do, just because I think it looks good, is duplicate the line art layer, turn on Gaussian blur on the bottom one, and then lower the opacity to my liking. This generally gives the line art a softer look. You can also do this as your last step because it does make it harder to fill the area using the bucket tool. I just like to do it earlier so I can see what the finished thing looks like, and I rarely use the bucket tool anyway, so it doesn't really matter when I do it in my case. After I adjusted the line art, I will then add my base color and the shading. I'm someone who works with very few layers, so sometimes I draw it directly on the base color layer and sometimes I make a new one. Just do what works best for you. For the shading, what I like to do is to first use a really big airbrush pen to just get a feeling of where I want the light and the shadows to be. The rule of thumb is the stronger the light, the darker the shadows. This will be easier to adjust later if you draw the shadows on a second layer, of course. For the smaller strands of hair, try to imagine where the light comes from. I will not claim that my shadows are always placed correctly. In all honesty, I just do what I think looks good most of the time, and I don't really pay attention to what's correct in the case of lighting. If I ever do a tutorial on that specifically, then I will make sure to study it first so I don't just teach you anything. If you have a separate shadow layer, then you could also technically lock it and use your airbrush to add a color gradient or make the shadows look softer. If you draw your character with a background, then you could also paint over the line art so it blends better, but that's another optional step and just a tip. Sometimes I also play around with an overlay layer and then just pick some colors with a big airbrush to make the whole thing glow more and be more colorful. Here are some examples of this style and where I used it or variations of it in my finished illustrations. The next style that I want to show you is a mix between the first one and the last one I will talk about. It's not as detailed as my illustration style, but also not as simple as my webcomic style. I often use it for my Instagram pictures, especially when I draw full body art or multiple characters in one picture. I simply do that mainly because it looks nicer for some drawings. You could imagine it like walking away from the picture in the first style and seeing it a little less detailed the further you stand away. Basically just do what I did for the first one, but this time we will add less of single hair strands. For this style you get the most out of it with shading and lighting alone, and the line art itself comes second. Zoom out of the picture and focus more on the overall look than the details. Again, here are some examples of the finished pictures again where I used this style. And the third style also starts the same, we will just use even less details here. This one is something that you want to go for when you animate, because the simpler the easier. That's why you often see big and easy shapes used in cartoons, or you can use it when you draw comics simply to save time, or when you draw a picture where the background is the main object of attention and your character is only drawn very small as an addition. You can see the differences directly side by side right here. And again, here are some examples of my comic where I worked with this. As promised, I also made a chapter about highlights, and generally there are so many different techniques it's impossible to name every single one, but honestly majority of them are self-explaining anyway, so I just drew some examples for you here. However, I want to talk about the first one specifically a little more, since that's technically the most complicated one and I didn't see a lot of people using this yet. So what you want to do is take an airbrush again and just add one big brush stroke across the hair. Depending on where you want the highlights, you have to adjust the position for yourself, of course. Keep in mind the highlights also change depending on the angle that you draw. When you're done with that, change to eraser and imagine you make kind of a zigzag pattern, one from the bottom and one from the top. Try to not just make W's and change the size and frequency sometimes. After that, you want to pay attention to where the hair strands split, and in these areas you want to erase some parts. And optionally, you can also lock the layer and use a few different colors on your highlights. That's just a matter of taste. This may have been quite a lot at once, but I hope this tutorial helped you a little and maybe it even gave you some motivation to draw today. Remember to never give up and always practice, cause the learning process never stops, and that's a beautiful thing. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. I hope to see you in the next video. All my links are down in the description. Have a great morning, day or night, and bye!